September 1882. Millerton, Texas. 10 mail-order brides stepped off the train, but only one would face public humiliation so brutal it would either destroy her or forge her into something unbreakable. Clara May Holt wasn't just the last woman chosen. She was the woman whispered about, pointed at, returned like defective merchandise. But when a grief-hollowed widower named Ethan Crowell made an impossible choice that stunned the entire town, neither of them knew that a single act of defiance would ignite a firestorm of judgment, survival, and a love that refused to apologize for existing. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you believe second chances are real, hit that like button and stay until the end. The depot platform in Millerton, Texas burned under the September sun like a skillet left too long on the fire. Heat shimmered off the railroad tracks in waves thick enough to blur the horizon, and the air tasted of dust, coal smoke, and something sharper, anticipation mixed with cruelty. Clara May Holt stood with 9 other women in a ragged line, her carpet bag clutched against her ribs, her spine straight despite everything inside her wanting to curl inward and disappear. She'd learned early that posture mattered. When people were already looking for reasons to dismiss you, slouching gave them permission. The train's whistle still echoed in the distance, a mournful sound that seemed to carry all her doubts with it. Behind her, the locomotive hissed and groaned like a living creature, impatient to be gone. Ahead, a crowd had gathered, men mostly, ranchers and farmers and shopkeepers, their wives standing slightly apart with expressions that ranged from curious to contemptuous. The women's gazes felt like probing fingers, searching for flaws, cataloging failures. Claire had plenty of both. The crowd just didn't know the full inventory yet. Ladies, if you'll stand where you are, the gentlemen will make their selections in an orderly fashion. The land agent, a thin man named Horace Pettigrew, who smelled of bay rum and self-importance, gestured with his ledger. His voice carried the practiced cheerfulness of someone conducting business he'd done 100 times before. Remember, this is a dignified proceeding. We're building families here, building futures. Dignified. Clara almost laughed. There was nothing dignified about standing in a line while men walked past, examining you like livestock at auction. But she'd known what she was signing up for when she'd answered the advertisement 6 weeks ago in St. Louis. Respectable women sought for marriage to prosperous ranchers in Texas. Transportation provided. Character references required. She'd stretched the truth on those character references. Not lied exactly, but stretched. The minister who'd signed for her hadn't known the full story. That she'd been married before. That she'd been sent back by a husband who'd decided barrenness was grounds for dissolving their arrangement. That her first attempt at mail-order matrimony had ended with her standing on a different platform in a different town, humiliation burning through her like fever. This was her second chance, possibly her last. The first selection happened quickly. A tall rancher with silver threading his temples approached a pretty blonde named Sarah Whitfield. Sarah had talked the entire train ride about her father's general store in Ohio, about how she'd always dreamed of Western adventure. The rancher introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, owner of the Triple B spread. Sarah's smile could have lit the whole depot. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Whitfield?" "I would, Mr. Brennan." Sarah's voice trembled with excitement. The crowd murmured approval. Mrs. Pettigrew, the agent's wife, stepped forward to witness as the couple moved to the side, already talking softly. 1 down, 9 to go. The second and third selections followed in quick succession. A sturdy woman named Marjorie Jones, who'd mentioned she could slaughter a hog and render lard, caught the attention of a pig farmer. A quiet, dark-haired girl named Rachel Miller, barely 18, was chosen by a young homesteader who looked almost as nervous as she did. With each selection, the crowd's attention shifted, reformed, concentrated on the remaining women. And with each selection, Clara felt the weight of those stares growing heavier on her shoulders. By the 5th selection, she noticed the whispers starting. "That one there, the tall one with the brown hair. Heard she's been through this before. Sent back, I heard. Defective goods." Clara kept her eyes forward, her face carefully neutral. She'd gotten good at this, too, at pretending words couldn't cut. But they could. They always could. A prosperous-looking man in a black coat approached the line, his gaze sweeping across the remaining women. When his eyes landed on Clara, something flickered in his expression. Interest, perhaps, or just curiosity. He started to move toward her, and for one desperate moment Clara let herself hope. Then Horace Pettigrew appeared at the man's elbow, leaning in close, speaking in a voice just low enough that Clara had to strain to hear it. "Not that one, Mr. Hendricks. I'd suggest Miss Patterson there, or Miss Crowley. Both fine women with excellent references." The man's gaze shifted away from Clara as though she'd ceased to exist. He approached a petite redhead named Violet Patterson instead. Violet beamed. Another couple moved to the side. The platform seemed to grow larger with each selection, the remaining women standing farther apart, the spaces between them expanding like wounds opening. 6 women left, then 5, then 4. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. Why's she even here again? Didn't work out the first time? Barren as a salt flat, that's what I heard. No man wants a wife who can't give him sons. Shameful, really, trying again after being returned. 3 women, then 2. The sun beat down mercilessly. Sweat trickled down Clara's spine, dampening the fabric of her green traveling dress, the nicest thing she owned, carefully pressed that morning with hope that now felt foolish. Her hands ached from gripping her carpet bag. Her face felt frozen in its careful neutrality, a mask she'd worn so long she'd almost forgotten what her real expression looked like underneath. When the second-to-last woman was chosen, a widow named Mrs. Callahan, who'd been frank about needing security more than romance, Clara found herself standing alone. The last one. The unwanted one. The platform fell silent except for the creak of wagon wheels, the stamp of horses, the distant bark of a dog. Every face turned toward her, some pitying, most judgmental, a few openly amused. This was entertainment now. The spectacle of a woman's humiliation served up fresh in the Texas heat. Horace Pettigrew cleared his throat, consulting his ledger with exaggerated care. "Well now, it appears we have 1 lady remaining and 1 gentleman yet to arrive. Mr. Ethan Crowell sent word he'd be delayed due to fixing a fence his no-account neighbors keep cutting." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, rough and low, and carrying an edge like a warning. The crowd parted, and Clara saw him for the first time. Ethan Crowell didn't look like the other ranchers who'd come to claim their brides. He was tall, taller than most men present, with shoulders that suggested hard labor and a face that seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. Dark hair fell to his collar, longer than was fashionable. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots scuffed, his hat shadowing eyes that she couldn't quite read. But what struck Clara most was the emptiness in those eyes. Not cruelty, not coldness exactly, just a profound absence, as though something vital had been hollowed out and never replaced. He walked through the crowd without acknowledging anyone, his stride steady but carrying a kind of contained isolation, like a man who'd gotten used to taking up as little space in the world as possible. When he reached the platform, he stopped, his gaze finding Clara and holding there. She lifted her chin, meeting his stare directly. If this was another rejection, she'd face it standing straight. "You're Miss Holt." It wasn't a question. "I am." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Clara May Holt." Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to name. He glanced at Horace Pettigrew. "This the one designated for me?" Pettigrew hesitated, and in that hesitation Clara saw her fate taking shape. "Mr. Crowell, if I might have a word in private." "No need for privacy. Ask your questions here." The agent's thin face flushed. "It's not questions exactly, sir. Well, there are certain circumstances regarding Miss Holt that you should be made aware of. Matters of previous arrangements that didn't conclude satisfactorily." The crowd leaned in, hungry for this. "Previous arrangements." Ethan's tone gave nothing away. "You mean she's been married before?" "Not married exactly. An arrangement that was dissolved, due to certain, shall we say, domestic shortcomings." Clara's fingernails bit into her palms. Domestic shortcomings. Such polite words for being declared worthless. "What kind of shortcomings?" Ethan asked, his gaze still on Clara. Pettigrew lowered his voice, but not enough. "Childlessness, Mr. Crowell. The woman is barren. The previous gentleman felt this was grounds for..." felt it was grounds to humiliate her publicly and send her back like a defective plow. Ethan's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. That what you're trying to pretty up with your $5 words? The agent's flush deepened. Mr. Crowell, I'm simply trying to provide full disclosure so you can make an informed... I've made my choice. Ethan climbed the platform steps, his boots heavy on the wood. He approached Clara directly, stopping close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. I'm Ethan Crowell. I run a cattle ranch 15 miles west of here. It's hard work, isolated work. The house is decent, the land is fair. I'm offering marriage in name, with boundaries we'll discuss private. If that suits you, I'll sign whatever papers need signing. Clara searched his face, trying to understand what she was seeing. His words were formal, almost cold, but there was something underneath them, not warmth exactly, but a kind of weary recognition, as though he saw in her something that matched what lived in him. And if it doesn't suit me? She asked, needing to know if she had any choice at all. Then you don't sign, and I pay your return fare to wherever you came from. Honest, blunt, offering her a way out even as he offered a way forward. Behind him, the crowd's whispers rose like a swarm. Can't believe he'd take damaged goods. Must be desperate. Neither of them right in the head. Clara barely heard them. She was looking at this hollow-eyed stranger, this man who'd walked through mockery and judgment like it was weather he'd learned to endure, and she was making a calculation that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. It suits me, she said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. I'll sign. Ethan nodded once, something easing in his shoulders that might have been relief. He turned to Pettigrew. Draw up the papers. The agent sputtered, Mr. Crowell, perhaps you'd like time to reconsider. The papers, Pettigrew, unless there's some law against a man choosing his own wife. There wasn't, of course. With visible reluctance, the agent produced the marriage contract from his ledger, spreading it on a makeshift table someone had brought forward. The document was standard for mail-order arrangements, a civil contract witnessed by the land agent and his wife, legally binding but without the religious ceremony some couples preferred. Clara read it carefully before signing, her finger tracing each line. The terms were simple: mutual obligation, shared property, legal partnership. Nothing about love, nothing about children, nothing about what happened if either of them failed to be what the other needed. She picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, and signed her name in the careful script she'd learned from her mother. Clara May Holt. For the last time, probably. After this, she'd be Clara Crowell, whether the name ever felt real or not. Ethan signed beside her, his handwriting angular and efficient. Mrs. Pettigrew witnessed with a pinched expression, as though she disapproved of the entire proceeding but couldn't quite find grounds to refuse. There, Horace Pettigrew said, blotting the signatures with powder. Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Crowell, may you, that is, I hope you'll find, well, congratulations. The word fell flat, unenthusiastic. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. A few people shook their heads and turned away, their free entertainment concluded. Others lingered, still whispering, still judging. Ethan took the signed papers, folded them precisely, and tucked them inside his coat. Then he looked at Clara. You have other bags besides that one? A trunk. It's in the freight car. I'll get it loaded. He moved past her, back toward the train, and Clara found herself standing alone on the platform again. But this time, she wasn't unwanted. She was chosen. The distinction felt strange, significant, and entirely terrifying. Mrs. Pettigrew approached with a tight smile. I suppose I should offer some advice, being a married woman myself. Clara waited, bracing for more judgment disguised as wisdom. Don't expect softness from a man like that, the older woman said quietly. Ethan Crowell lost his wife and baby 3 years back. Fever took them both inside a week. He's been a ghost ever since. Does his business, pays his debts, keeps to himself. You're the first sign of life he's shown in years, and I'd wager it's desperation more than preference that brought him here today. The word should have stung, but Clara had developed immunity to cruelty masked as concern. Thank you for the advice, Mrs. Pettigrew. I'm just saying, don't expect him to suddenly become the husband you might have dreamed of. That man's heart is buried with his first wife. Then it's fortunate I'm not expecting hearts at all, Clara replied evenly. Just honest work and fair treatment. That's more than most women get. Mrs. Pettigrew's mouth thinned. She started to respond, but Ethan returned then, Clara's battered trunk balanced on one shoulder as though it weighed nothing. He carried it to a wagon hitched nearby, a sturdy farm wagon with high sides pulled by two dark horses that stood patiently in the heat. He loaded the trunk into the back with her carpet bag, then turned to Clara. Ready? Such a simple question, but loaded with weight. Was she ready? Ready to leave behind everything familiar, even the familiar pain? Ready to tie her future to a stranger who looked at the world through the eyes of someone who'd stopped believing in futures at all? Ready, she said, because what else could she say? Ethan offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. His palm was calloused, his grip firm but impersonal, the way you'd help anyone climb aboard. No particular warmth, no lingering contact. Clara settled herself on the worn bench, arranging her skirts, her hands folding in her lap with practiced composure. Ethan climbed up beside her, taking the reins in capable hands. He didn't look at the remaining crowd, didn't acknowledge the stares or whispers. He simply clicked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching on the hard-packed earth. They rolled away from the depot, away from the judging faces and cruel whispers, away from the last shreds of Clara's old life. The town of Millerton spread before them, a main street of false-fronted buildings, a church with a white steeple, houses scattered beyond in no particular pattern. People paused in doorways to watch them pass, and Clara felt their attention like physical pressure. The woman nobody wanted, claimed by the man everyone avoided. She kept her spine straight, her face forward. Let them look, let them whisper. She'd survived worse than gossip. They reached the edge of town where buildings gave way to open land, rolling prairie that stretched toward distant hills, grass the color of old gold, sky so wide it made her feel dizzy. The road became a rutted track winding westward, and with each rotation of the wagon wheels, the silence between them grew heavier. Finally, Ethan spoke. We need to establish some things clear before we reach the ranch. All right. Clara kept her voice neutral. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I needed a legal wife for certain property matters. Inheritance issues I won't bore you with. You needed a place to go that wasn't back to wherever you came from. That's the full extent of our agreement. Blunt, honest. Clara appreciated both qualities even as they stung slightly. I understand, she said. The house has 4 rooms. Main living area with the kitchen, my bedroom, a guest room I don't use, and a lean-to addition I built off the back. The lean-to is yours. It has a door with a lock on the inside. Your privacy is your own. I won't enter without permission. Clara turned to look at him then, studying his profile. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He was laying out rules the way a foreman might assign tasks, clear, unemotional, leaving no room for misunderstanding. What about household duties? She asked carefully. Cooking, cleaning, those things are shared work or your choice entirely. I can manage my own meals if you prefer separate arrangements. Laundry likewise. I won't expect you to mend my clothes or tend me like a servant. You do your share, I do mine, or we figure something that works for both of us. This wasn't how mail-order marriages typically functioned. Clara had heard enough stories from the other brides to know that most arrangements came with clear expectations. Wifely duties in exchange for financial support, household management in exchange for status. Ethan was offering something entirely different, something that felt safer and lonelier in equal measure. And if I want more? The question escaped before she could stop it, but she didn't regret asking. If I want actual partnership, not just parallel living? Ethan's hands tightened briefly on the reins. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but don't expect it soon and don't expect it easy. I'm not the man I was before I lost them. I don't know if that man exists anymore. The grief in his voice was old, settled deep like sediment at the bottom of a well. Clara recognized it because she carried her own version, not from death, but from rejection, from being found wanting, from learning that sometimes the worst wounds came from being unwanted rather than unloved. Fair enough, she said quietly. But the same goes for you. I'm not who I was before either. Being returned, being called barren like it's the only thing that matters about a woman, that changes you. So if you're expecting some soft, grateful creature who'll be content with scraps of kindness, you'll be disappointed. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Good. Soft things don't last out here. They fell into silence again, but it felt different now. Less hostile. More like two people who'd laid down their weapons without quite becoming allies, settling into an uneasy truce that might, with time and luck, become something more. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and scrub oak. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. Hawks circled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Clara pulled her bonnet lower to shield her face. After about an hour, Ethan spoke again. We'll pass my nearest neighbor soon, Fletcher's place. They'll probably be watching. Helen Fletcher doesn't miss much that happens on this road. Should I wave? Clara asked, only half joking. Do what you want, but don't expect warmth. The Fletchers are good people in their way, but they keep to themselves, and they expect the same from others. As if summoned by his words, a farmhouse appeared ahead. A solid structure with a wide porch, corrals, and outbuildings, fields of what looked like wheat stretching beyond. A woman stood on the porch, her hand shading her eyes, watching their approach. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched, her expression unreadable at this distance. Clara lifted her hand in greeting anyway. The woman on the porch didn't respond, just turned and disappeared inside the house. Welcome to the neighborhood, Ethan said dryly. They continued west, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The beauty of it caught Clara by surprise. She'd been so focused on survival, on managing expectations and protecting herself, that she'd forgotten to notice where she was. This land was harsh, unforgiving, but it held a stark magnificence that made something in her chest ache. It's beautiful, she said softly. Ethan glanced at her, then at the sunset as though seeing it for the first time in years. I suppose it is. I stopped noticing somewhere along the way. Maybe you'll notice again. The words were quiet. Not quite a promise, not quite a hope. He didn't respond, but his shoulders relaxed slightly, some invisible burden easing just enough to let him breathe deeper. Another hour passed. The road climbed gently, winding through hills that grew rockier, more rugged. Trees appeared, oak and cedar, their branches casting long shadows in the fading light. And then, as they crested a rise, Clara saw it. Ethan's ranch. The house was larger than she'd expected, a two-story structure built of rough-hewn timber and stone, with a wide porch across the front and a chimney rising from the center. The roof was cedar shake, weathered but sound. Behind the house stood a barn, several corrals, a windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. A creek ran somewhere nearby. She could hear it even if she couldn't see it yet. It was isolated, certainly. The nearest neighbor was miles behind them. But it wasn't desolate. Someone had built this place with care, had chosen this spot for its water and shelter and the view it commanded of the surrounding land. This is it, Ethan said unnecessarily. The Double C Ranch. Named for Caroline, my wife, and Catherine, my daughter. Clara heard the pain beneath the names, old but still sharp. It's a good name. It's their memorial. Only memorial they have, since the fever took them so fast we couldn't even... He stopped, his jaw clenching. Never mind. Not your burden to carry. But grief was never that simple, never that contained. Clara knew it spread like water, seeping into everything, and anyone living in its proximity would feel the dampness eventually. Ethan drove the wagon to the front of the house, setting the brake and looping the reins. He climbed down, then offered his hand again to help Clara descend. Her legs felt unsteady after hours of sitting, and she held his arm a moment longer than necessary, finding her balance. I'll show you around, he said, releasing her. Then you can decide which room you want, the lean-to or the guest room. Either is yours. He led her up the porch steps. The wood was solid under her feet, worn smooth by years of use. The door opened with a creak that suggested it didn't get opened often, and Clara stepped into her new home. The main room was larger than she'd expected, a combined living area and kitchen with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a cook stove in the corner, a heavy wooden table with mismatched chairs. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes and books and various tools. Everything was clean but spare, functional, without any softness. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor. No photographs or decorations except a single-frame tintype on the mantel, a young woman holding an infant, both of them smiling at whoever had taken the picture. Caroline and Catherine. The ghost who lived here still. Clara didn't comment on the photograph. Instead, she turned slowly, taking in the space that would be her domain, at least in part. "Kitchen's well stocked," Ethan said, his tone businesslike again. "Root cellar out back keeps things cool. Chickens in the coop, you'll hear them in the morning. Creek is 40 yards past the barn, good clean water. Springhouse keeps milk and butter fresh." He moved through the room, pointing out practical details, where the firewood was stacked, which pump drew from the well, where he kept the lamp oil. Clara listened, memorizing, understanding that this recitation of facts was easier for him than anything personal. "My room is through there." He indicated a door on the left. "Guest room is there." Another door on the right. The lean-to is out the back door, attached to the house, but separate. "Can I see the lean-to?" Clara asked. Ethan nodded, leading her through the kitchen and out the back door. The lean-to was exactly as described, a simple addition built against the back wall of the house, with its own entrance and a small window. Inside was a narrow bed, a chest for storage, a washstand, hooks for hanging clothes. Plain, but private. And most importantly, the door had a lock on the inside, just as he'd promised. Clara ran her hand along the door frame, feeling the smooth wood, the sturdy construction. A room of her own. A door she could lock. Space that nobody could violate without her permission. "This is perfect," she said quietly. Ethan's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or relief. "You're sure? The guest room is larger, has better light." "This is perfect," Claire repeated. "Thank you for building it." "Built it last month, once I knew you were coming. Figured you'd want your own space." He cleared his throat. "I'll bring your trunk in." He left her standing in the lean-to, and Clara sank onto the narrow bed, her hands trembling slightly now that she was alone. The day crashed over her all at once. The humiliation on the platform, the crowd's cruelty, this strange, hollow man who'd chosen her anyway, the long, silent journey, and now this. A room with a lock, a place where she could be safe. She pressed her palms to her eyes, breathing slow and deliberate, refusing to cry even though the tears pressed close. Crying was for later, in the dark, when nobody could see. Outside, she heard Ethan moving her trunk, the scrape and thump of it being carried. Then his footsteps, and a quiet knock on her door. "It's by your door," he said through the wood. "I'll give you time to settle. There's bread and cheese in the kitchen if you're hungry. I'll be in the barn tending the horses." "Thank you," Clara managed. His footsteps retreated. She heard the back door close, then silence. Clara stood, opened her door, and found her trunk waiting exactly as he'd said. She dragged it inside. It was lighter now, holding only what remained of her old life, and closed the door behind her. The lock clicked with a sound that felt like safety. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara allowed herself to breathe without guarding every inhale. This wasn't what she'd dreamed of when she'd answered the advertisement for mail-order brides. It wasn't romance or partnership or even basic companionship. It was cold pragmatism wrapped in courtesy. Two damaged people agreeing to occupy the same space without inflicting further damage on each other. But it was honest. And after everything she'd endured, the first husband who'd declared her worthless, the shame of being returned, the platform today where she'd stood as public spectacle, honesty felt like something she could build on. Clara unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses on the hooks, placing her hairbrush and mirror on the washstand, folding her undergarments into the chest. Each item found its place in this new room, in this new life. When she reached the bottom of the trunk, she found the one thing she'd carried through both marriages, a quilt her mother had made, stitched in a pattern called wedding ring. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spread the quilt over the narrow bed, smoothing the fabric with careful hands. The colors were faded now, blues and yellows and greens that had once been vibrant, but the stitching was still strong, her mother's tiny, perfect stitches holding everything together even after all these years. Marriage is like quilting, her mother had told her while making this. You take scraps that don't seem to match, and you find ways to make them fit. You stitch them together with patience and care, and what you create is stronger than any single piece alone. Her mother had been wrong, of course. Some scraps couldn't be made to fit no matter how careful the stitching. Some marriages were doomed from the start. But maybe, this strange arrangement with Ethan Crowell wasn't about fitting together at all. Maybe it was about giving each other room to exist without requiring transformation or pretense. Maybe that was enough. Clara changed out of her traveling dress into a simpler cotton work dress, washed her face and hands in the basin, and pinned her hair back more practically. Then she squared her shoulders and went to find her husband. He was in the barn as promised, brushing down one of the horses with long, methodical strokes. The other horse, already groomed, munched hay in its stall. The barn smelled of leather and straw and animal warmth, familiar scents that reminded Clara of her childhood on her father's farm. Ethan looked up when she entered, his hand pausing mid-stroke. "You settled?" "As settled as I can be in one evening." Clara moved closer, running her hand along the stall gate. "This is good work, the barn, I mean. Solid construction. Built it myself. Caroline and I she insisted on helping even though she was carrying Catherine at the time. Said if she was going to live on a ranch, she needed to know how things were built." His voice went distant, remembering. She was stubborn that way. Clara heard the love beneath the words, the kind of love that survives death and turns into both comfort and torment. "She sounds like she was strong," Clara offered carefully. "She was." Ethan resumed brushing the horse, his movement steady. "Too strong sometimes. Wouldn't admit when she was tired or sick. By the time the fever showed symptoms, it was already too far gone. Took her in 3 days, Catherine in 4. The pain in his voice was so raw, Clara felt it in her own chest. "I'm sorry." "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't bring them back." He set down the brush with more force than necessary, then closed his eyes briefly. "That wasn't fair. You didn't deserve that." "It's all right. Grief isn't fair. It doesn't follow rules." Ethan looked at her then, really looked, and Clara saw recognition in his eyes. The recognition of someone who'd also learned that pain didn't care about fairness or timing or who deserved what. "You know," he said quietly, "you know what it's like. Different kind of loss, but yes. I know what it's like to have something ripped away and be expected to just continue." They stood in the barn with the horses shifting and settling around them, two strangers who'd somehow found themselves in the same life, bound by contracts and circumstance and a shared understanding that sometimes survival was the only victory worth claiming. "There's bread and cheese," Ethan said finally, breaking the moment. "And I can make coffee if you want." "I'd like that." Clara paused. "And tomorrow, I'll start earning my keep. Whatever needs doing around here, I'll do it. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not proving anything. I'm establishing terms. You gave me a room with a lock and asked nothing in return. That's more than fair. So I'll do my share and then some, not because I owe you, but because that's who I am. Clear?" Something that might have been respect flickered across Ethan's face. "Clear?" They walked back to the house together as the last light faded from the sky. The stars were beginning to emerge, more stars than Clara had ever seen in her life, scattered across the darkness like someone had spilled diamonds. The air had cooled significantly, the heat of the day giving way to the crisp chill of a September night. Inside, Ethan lit lamps while Clara sliced bread and arranged cheese on a plate. They ate at the table in near silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. The meal was simple but satisfying, and Clara realized she hadn't eaten since early morning, before the train had pulled into Millerton. After the meal, Ethan showed her how the cook stove worked, where he kept various supplies, which pump drew the best water. Practical information delivered in practical terms. No warmth, but no coldness either. Just information she'd need to function in this space. "I'll be up early," he said finally, as the clock on the mantel showed nearly 9. "Usually out to check the herd by first light. Coffee's already ground, stove's easy to start if you know how to manage the damper." "I know how to manage a stove." Clara stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "I'll have coffee ready when you come back if you want." "That'd be..." That'd be good. Thank you. They stood there, awkward as strangers at a church social, neither quite sure how to end this first day as husband and wife. Well, Clara said, good night then. Good night. She retreated to her lean-to, closing the door and turning the lock with a soft click. The small space felt safe, enclosed, hers. She changed into her nightgown, washed again, and climbed into the narrow bed with her mother's quilt pulled up to her chin. Through the wall, she could hear Ethan moving in the main house, the scrape of a chair, the settle of the fire, his footsteps crossing to his own room. Then silence. Clara stared at the dark ceiling, her mind replaying the day in fragments. The platform, the whispers, Ethan's face when he'd chosen her, the long ride, this strange house with its ghosts, the lock on her door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She'd have to learn the rhythms of this place, figure out how to coexist with a man who'd made it clear he expected nothing but offered safety. She'd have to prove herself useful, valuable, worth the risk he'd taken in claiming her publicly. But tonight, in this small room with its locked door, Clara allowed herself a moment of something that felt dangerously close to hope. She'd been the last bride, the unwanted one. The woman marked as defective, barren, returned, but she'd been chosen anyway by a man who understood what it meant to be hollowed out and still keep breathing. It wasn't love. It wasn't even the beginning of love. But it was a chance. And Clara May Holt, now Clara May Crowell, had learned to build entire futures on nothing more than that. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and small victories. And in her narrow bed, in her locked room, the last bride finally slept, her dreams troubled but her rest deep, the exhaustion of the day pulling her under like a tide. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it the hard work of learning to live in this new skin, this new name, this new life built on boundaries and honesty instead of promises neither of them could keep. But for tonight, she was safe. She was chosen. She was exactly where she needed to be. And sometimes that was all anyone could ask for. The rooster's crow split the dawn like an axe through wood, sharp and insistent. Clara woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar walls, the narrow bed, the quality of light filtering through the small window. Then memory rushed back. The platform, Ethan, the long ride, this lean-to room with its blessed lock. Her new life. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn chill, her fingers fumbling slightly with buttons and laces. The work dress she'd chosen was practical, brown calico that wouldn't show dirt, sturdy enough for whatever labor the day demanded. She pinned her hair back tightly, washed her face in the cold water from the basin, and steeled herself for whatever came next. When she emerged from her room, the main house was silent. No lamp lit, no fire crackling. Through the window, she could see the barest hint of pink touching the eastern horizon. Ethan hadn't lied about early rising. His bedroom door stood open, the room beyond empty, his bed already made with military precision. Clara set about starting the cook stove, grateful for the skills her mother had drilled into her years ago. The damper adjusted just so, kindling arranged properly, a match struck and held until the flames caught. Within minutes, she had a fire going strong enough to heat the coffee pot. She found the ground coffee where Ethan had indicated, measured it into the pot with water from the pump, and set it on the stove to boil. While it heated, she explored the kitchen more thoroughly than she'd been able to last night. The shelves held basics: flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, dried beans, preserves in mason jars. The root cellar, accessed through a trap door near the back door, revealed potatoes, onions, carrots, and apples stored in careful rows. Someone had planned for winter. Someone had thought ahead. The coffee began to bubble and hiss, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Clara found 2 tin cups, poured one for herself, and stood by the window watching the sky lighten. The land revealed itself gradually. Rolling hills, the dark shapes of cattle in the distance, the creak she'd heard last night now visible as a silver thread winding through cottonwoods. It was beautiful in a harsh, uncompromising way. Nothing soft about this landscape. Nothing forgiving. The back door opened and Ethan entered with a bucket of fresh milk. He stopped when he saw her, surprise flickering across his face, as though he'd forgotten she existed. "Coffee's ready," Clara said, gesturing to the pot. "I can smell it." He set the milk bucket on the counter, then moved to the washstand to scrub his hands. "You didn't have to wake so early. I told you I'd earn my keep. That starts now." Ethan dried his hands on a towel, watching her with that same unreadable expression from yesterday. "You planning to work yourself to death to prove some point?" "I'm planning to work because that's what I do. If you have a problem with that, say so now." Instead of answering, he poured himself coffee, took a long drink, and nodded. "It's good. Better than I make." Low bar to clear, I'd imagine. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Fair assessment." They stood in the kitchen as the dawn strengthened, drinking coffee, not quite companionable, but not hostile either. Clara waited for him to outline the day's work, to give her orders or instructions, but he seemed content with silence. Finally, she broke it. "What needs doing today?" "Depends on what you can do." "I can do most things. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, gardening. I can milk, churn butter, tend chickens, slaughter and dress poultry if needed. I can ride if the horse is gentle, shoot if the gun isn't too heavy. I can read, write, and cipher. I can nurse basic ailments and set simple breaks. What I can't do is rope cattle or mend fences, but I'm willing to learn if you're willing to teach." Ethan's eyebrows had risen progressively through her recitation. "That's quite a list." "I grew up on a farm. Father believed daughters should be as capable as sons. Mother believed idleness was the devil's invitation." Clara set down her cup. "So, give me work, and I'll do it." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression she was being reassessed, recategorized in his mind from burden to potential asset. "All right," he said finally. "The chickens need feeding and their eggs collected. After that, there's laundry. I've been letting it pile up. If you feel ambitious, the garden behind the house needs weeding and harvest. Beans are ready, tomatoes too. This afternoon, I'll show you around the property proper so you know the lay of the land." "Understood." Clara refilled both their cups. "What about meals? What are you used to eating?" "Whatever's available. I'm not particular." "That's not an answer. Do you prefer biscuits or cornbread? Beef or pork? Do you have vegetables you won't eat?" Ethan looked almost uncomfortable with the questions, as though nobody had asked his preferences in years. "Biscuits, I suppose." "Beef. I'll eat any vegetable that's not turnips. Can't abide turnips." "Then I won't cook turnips." Clara moved to the shelves, mentally planning. "I'll make breakfast now. Biscuits, eggs, bacon if you have it. Then I'll tackle the work you mentioned. There's bacon in the spring house. And Clara—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "You don't have to cook me 3 meals a day. I can manage." "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression again, that same flicker of respect she'd seen last night. "There is," he agreed quietly. "All right then. I'll bring in the bacon." He left through the back door, and Clara set about making biscuits with swift efficiency. Her hands knew the work: flour, lard, buttermilk from the fresh milk Ethan had brought in, just enough salt. She had the dough mixed and cut by the time he returned with a thick slab of bacon wrapped in cheesecloth. "You work fast," he observed. "Comes from years of practice." Clara sliced the bacon, laid it in the skillet heating on the stove. Soon the kitchen filled with the sizzle and smell of cooking meat, rich and savory. "How many eggs do you usually eat?" "3. 4 if I'm doing heavy work." She cracked 8 eggs into a bowl, 4 for him, 4 for her, and scrambled them with a splash of milk and a pinch of salt. The biscuits went into the oven, the bacon finished crisping, and within 20 minutes she had breakfast plated and on the table. Ethan sat across from her, looking at the food with something close to bewilderment. "I haven't had a meal like this in 3 years. "Then it's past time you did." They ate in silence, but it felt different from last night's awkwardness. This silence had purpose. The shared focus on a good meal. The acknowledgement that sustenance mattered. Clara noticed Ethan ate with focused attention, as though he'd forgotten food could be something more than fuel. When they finished, he carried his plate to the wash basin without being asked. "Thank you. Thank you." "You're welcome." Clara began clearing the table. "Now, go do whatever needs doing with your cattle. I'll handle things here." He hesitated at the door, as though about to say something, then simply nodded and left. Clara spent the morning working with the methodical intensity she'd perfected over years of proving her worth. The chickens were easy, a dozen hens and one arrogant rooster who tried to peck her before learning she wouldn't tolerate it. She scattered feed, collected eggs, noted which nesting boxes needed fresh straw. The laundry was more challenging, hauling water from the pump, heating it on the stove, scrubbing shirts and trousers and linens on the washboard until her knuckles were raw. She hung everything on the line strung between two posts behind the house, the clean clothes snapping in the warm breeze. While the wash dried, she tackled the garden. It had been planted with care but neglected recently. Weeds choking the rows, vegetables going overripe. She worked on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds, harvesting beans and tomatoes and squash, humming softly to herself without realizing it. This felt right. Physical work with visible results. No judgment, no eyes watching her, no whispers about her worth. Just earth and plants and the satisfaction of making something better than she'd found it. She was carrying the second basket of vegetables to the spring house when she heard horses approaching. Clara straightened, shading her eyes against the noon sun, and saw 3 riders coming up the track from the south. They weren't moving with the casual pace of neighbors. They were moving with purpose. Clara set down her basket and walked toward the house, arriving at the front porch just as Ethan emerged from the barn. His face had gone hard, his posture shifting into something defensive. The riders pulled up in the yard, 3 men, all rough-looking, all carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of people used to taking what they wanted. The one in front, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, grinned when he saw Ethan. "Well, well, Crowell. Heard you went and got yourself a wife." His eyes slid to Clara, crawling over her in a way that made her skin prickle. "Heard she was the leftover nobody wanted. But hell, she looks serviceable enough." Clara's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her face neutral. Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between her and the riders. "State your business, Hadley, then get off my land." So this was Roy Hadley, the man Ethan had mentioned briefly, the one he'd brought home from the fire line, the one who'd been disappointed to find Clara off limits. Hadley's grin widened. "Just being neighborly. Thought we'd come by and meet the new Mrs. Crowell. Make sure she knows there's other men around if this arrangement don't work out." "The arrangement is working fine. You can go now." One of the other riders, a thin man with a narrow face, laughed. "Awful protective of goods you picked up off the bargain shelf, Crowell. What's the matter? Afraid she'll realize she could do better?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Clara stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I assure you it's misplaced." Her voice was cool, controlled, every word precisely measured. "I chose this arrangement with my eyes open. If I'd wanted different, I would have made different choices. Now, as Mr. Hadley so astutely observed, I'm quite serviceable, which means I have work to do. Unless you're here to help with laundry or weeding, I suggest you move along." The yard went silent. Hadley's grin faded into something uglier. "Got a mouth on her, doesn't she?" "She does," Ethan said quietly, "and she's well within her rights to tell you to leave. So, leave." Hadley's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Clara thought he might push it further. But something in Ethan's stance, or maybe the rifle Clara now noticed leaning against the porch railing within easy reach, made him reconsider. "We'll be seeing you around, Crowell, and you too, Mrs. Crowell." Hadley tipped his hat mockingly. "Real neighborly of you both." The 3 riders wheeled their horses and galloped off, kicking up dust. Clara and Ethan stood watching until they disappeared over the rise. "I'm sorry about that," Ethan said finally. "Hadley's been trouble since he moved into the area 6 months ago. Squatting on land he doesn't own, cutting other people's fences, generally being a nuisance. Why don't the law handle him? Nearest law is 2 days' ride. By the time anyone gets there and back, evidence is gone and witnesses develop convenient amnesia." Ethan turned to look at her. "You handled that well. Better than I expected. Did you expect me to swoon? Or to take him up on his offer?" "No, I expected—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't know what I expected, but you stood your ground. That takes spine. I've had plenty of practice standing my ground. Men like Hadley aren't anything new." Clara retrieved her basket of vegetables. Though I appreciate you stepping between us. Seemed like the thing to do. They looked at each other for a moment, and Clara felt something shift. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. They were both fighters in their own ways, both scarred by different battles, both determined not to be broken by whatever came next. I should finish with these vegetables, Clara said finally, and I should check the south fence. Hadley's visit means he or his friends have probably been cutting wire again. Ethan moved toward the barn, then paused. Keep that rifle handy while I'm gone, just in case. I will. He saddled his horse and rode south, and Clara returned to her work, but with the rifle now leaning against the springhouse wall within arm's reach. The encounter with Hadley had shattered the morning's peaceful productivity, replacing it with an edge of tension that made her check the horizon every few minutes. By mid-afternoon, the vegetables were stored, the laundry was dry and folded, and Clara had baked bread from the sourdough starter she'd found in the pantry. The house smelled of yeast and flour and comfort, smells that made the space feel more like a home than it had this morning. She was sweeping the porch when Ethan returned, his face grim. 3 sections of fence cut, cattle scattered across 2 properties. Took me an hour just to round up what I could find. He dismounted stiffly, favoring his left side. I'll need to ride out again tomorrow, check if any are missing. Are you hurt? Just sore from too many hours in the saddle. Nothing serious. But Clara saw him wince when he bent to unsaddle his horse. Let me help with that. I can manage. I know you can manage. Let me help anyway. After a moment, he stepped back and let her work. Clara's hands were practiced with tack. She unbuckled straps, lifted the heavy saddle, carried it to the barn. When she returned, Ethan was brushing his horse with slow, careful strokes, his face tight with pain he was trying not to show. You should soak that, Clara said. Whatever you've pulled or strained, heat will help. Can't spare the time for soaking. Too much needs doing. Ethan. She waited until he looked at her. If you injure yourself seriously because you were too stubborn to rest, then nothing gets done. You're no good to this ranch broken down. He wanted to argue. She could see it in his face. But instead he nodded slowly. All right. After supper, maybe. After supper, Clara agreed. They worked together through the late afternoon, Ethan showing her around the property as he'd promised. The layout was larger than she'd realized, over 300 acres of grazing land, with the creek providing reliable water, timber in the northern section, good grass throughout. Ethan had built it carefully, strategically, choosing each improvement with thought for the future, a future he'd planned with Caroline. He didn't say it, but Clara heard it in the way he talked about certain decisions, saw it in the placement of the house to catch both sunrise and sunset, in the garden plot sized for a family rather than a solitary man. As the sun began its descent, they returned to the house. Clara prepared supper, beef steaks fried with onions, beans she'd cooked earlier, fresh bread with butter. They ate on the porch to catch the cooling evening air, and for the first time, Ethan initiated conversation. You know horses, he said. Where'd you learn? My father bred them. Draft horses mostly, but a few riding horses too. I grew up in barns and paddocks. Why'd you leave? Clara took a breath. My father died when I was 17. Influenza. Mother couldn't manage the farm alone, so we sold it and moved to the city, St. Louis. She took in sewing. I worked in a hat shop. 3 years of that was enough to make me desperate for anything different. So you answered an advertisement. I answered an advertisement. She met his eyes. First time I married a merchant in Kansas. He wanted a wife who'd give him sons to inherit his store. When it became clear I wouldn't have children, he decided I was useless. Sent me back to St. Louis like a defective order. That why you came back? Tried again? I came back because the alternative was spending the rest of my life as a seamstress in a cramped room, watching other people's lives happen while mine stayed frozen. At least this way I had a chance at something more. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. And now you're stuck on an isolated ranch with a man who can barely remember how to talk to another person. Must feel like jumping from one bad situation to another. Does it feel that way to you? Bad situation? He considered the question seriously. No. Uncomfortable, maybe. Strange, definitely, but not bad. Then maybe we're both doing better than we thought. Clara stood, collecting their plates. Now you're going to soak that injury like you promised, or I'll heat the water and pour it over your head myself." This time, he did smile, small and brief, but real. "Yes, ma'am." While Ethan soaked in the large washtub filled with hot water Clara had heated, she cleaned up from supper and prepared dough for tomorrow's bread. Through the wall, she could hear him moving occasionally, the slosh of water, a low sigh of relief as heat worked into sore muscles. She found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since before her first marriage. The work here was hard, the situation strange, but there was honesty in it. Ethan asked nothing she wasn't willing to give. He kept his promises. He treated her like a person rather than a problem to solve or a vessel to fill. It was more than she'd dared hope for standing on that platform yesterday. When Ethan emerged from his room dressed in clean clothes, his hair damp, moving more easily, Clara was kneading dough. "Better?" she asked. "Much. Thank you." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "You didn't have to do all this, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the garden. You're making me look like I was living in squalor. You were managing, but there's a difference between managing and thriving. I'm choosing to help us move from one to the other." Why? The question was simple, but Clara heard the weight beneath it. Why invest in a situation that might not last? Why care about a house that might never be a home? Why try for a man who'd made it clear his heart was buried with his first family? She looked up from the dough, meeting his eyes directly. "Because I'm tired of just surviving, Ethan. I'm tired of being less than I could be because circumstances or other people decided I wasn't worth the effort. So I'm choosing different. I'm choosing to make this work, whatever this ends up being. If that's just a business arrangement where we keep each other fed and the house standing, fine. But I won't do it halfway. I'll do it right or not at all." Ethan crossed his arms, studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone beaten down. Someone grateful just to have a roof. Someone who'd tiptoe around trying not to disturb me." He shook his head slowly. "You're none of those things." "No, I'm not. Is that a problem?" "No." The word came quickly, definitively. "It's not a problem. It's unexpected, but not a problem." They stood in the kitchen as the last light faded, the dough rising under Clara's hands, the air between them charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "I'll say good night then. Tomorrow's going to be a long day if I'm tracking down missing cattle." "Good night." He retreated to his room, and Clara finished with the dough, covered it, banked the fire in the stove. She washed up, locked herself in her lean-to, and lay in the darkness thinking about strange beginnings and unexpected possibilities. She was almost asleep when she heard it. A sound like thunder, but wrong. Too sustained, too focused. Clara sat up, listening. The sound grew louder, and then she recognized it. Wind. Not the gentle evening breeze, but something massive and building. She threw back her quilt and went to the window. The sky to the southwest glowed strange and greenish, and the air felt thick, electric. Every instinct from her childhood on the farm screamed danger. Clara grabbed her shawl and ran into the main house. "Ethan!" He emerged from his room already pulling on his boots, his face tense. "Storm coming. Bad one." "How bad?" As if in answer, the wind hit the house with force that shook the walls. Through the window, they could see debris beginning to fly. Branches, tumbleweeds, things Clara couldn't identify in the darkness. "Cellar," Ethan said sharply. "Now!" He grabbed the lamp while Clara ran to secure the back door. The wind fought her, nearly ripping the door from her hands before she got it latched. Outside, the roar grew louder, and Clara heard something that turned her blood cold. A sound like a freight train bearing down on them, massive and unstoppable. Ethan seized her arm. "Clara, move!" He pulled her toward the cellar door set in the floor of the main room, yanking it open to reveal steep stairs descending into darkness. Clara scrambled down, Ethan right behind her, pulling the door shut just as the roar became deafening. The cellar was small, cramped, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. Ethan set the lamp on a shelf, its light casting wild shadows as the building above them began to scream. Wood splintered, glass shattered. The very air seemed to compress, pressing against Clara's eardrums until they ached, and then the house started coming apart. The sound was like nothing Clara had ever heard, destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Above them, timber cracked and tore. She heard the unmistakable sound of walls collapsing, the roof ripping away. Debris rained against the cellar door, and Clara realized with sick certainty that if that door gave way, they were dead. Ethan must have had the same thought. He moved to position himself on the stairs, his back against the door, his arms braced against the frame, using his body as a brace to hold it closed. "Get back!" he shouted over the roar. "Against the far wall!" Clara pressed herself into the corner, her arms wrapped around her head, praying to anything that might listen. The lamp guttered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. The roar went on, eternal, apocalyptic, the sound of the world ending. Something massive hit the door. Ethan grunted with the impact, his body taking the force, keeping the door from caving in. Clara heard him straining, heard the ragged edge of his breathing, and without thinking, she scrambled up the stairs to help. "I said get back," Ethan yelled. "Like hell!" Clara wedged herself beside him, adding her weight to his, her hands gripping the doorframe, her entire body screaming with the effort of holding the door closed against the storm's fury. They braced together in the pitch dark, two people who'd promised each other nothing but boundaries and business arrangements, now holding each other up in the most literal sense possible. Clara felt Ethan's shoulder against hers, his ragged breathing matching her own, his strength supplementing hers when her arms began to shake. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roar began to fade. The pressure eased, the impacts against the door stopped. The wind's shriek dropped to a howl, then to a strong breeze, then to near silence. Clara and Ethan stayed braced for several more seconds, neither willing to trust the quiet. Then slowly, Ethan eased his weight off the door. "Stay here," he said hoarsely. "Let me check." He pushed the cellar door open cautiously. Debris cascaded down the stairs. Wood, shingles, things Clara couldn't identify in the darkness. Ethan climbed carefully, and Clara heard his sharp intake of breath. "Oh, God!" Clara climbed after him, emerging into what had been the main room of the house, or what was left of it. The roof was gone. Completely gone. The walls on the eastern side had collapsed inward, and through the gaps Clara could see the barn, or what remained of it, leaning at an impossible angle, its roof partially caved in. The lean-to addition where she'd slept was simply gone, torn away entirely, her belongings scattered across the landscape or vanished into the night. The devastation was complete, total, impossible to process. Ethan stood in the wreckage, his face bloodless in the moonlight that now poured through the missing roof. Caroline's photograph. It was on the mantel. Clara understood immediately. She began searching through the debris, lifting boards and shingles, ignoring the cuts and splinters. After several minutes, she found it. The frame cracked, the glass shattered, but the tintype itself miraculously intact. She brought it to Ethan, placing it carefully in his hands. He stared at the image of his first wife and daughter, his throat working, and Clara saw the moment his careful control began to crack. "Everything," he said roughly. "Everything I built for them. Gone." "Not everything. You're still here. I'm still here." Clara touched his arm gently. "Buildings can be rebuilt." Before he could respond, they heard it. A sound from the direction of the Fletcher place. Not the wind. Someone shouting. Ethan's head snapped up. "That's Fletcher! Something's wrong!" Despite exhaustion, despite the shock, they ran toward the sound, scrambling over debris and fallen trees. As they crested the rise between properties, Clara saw it. The Fletcher farmhouse was partially collapsed, and in the wreckage she could see figures moving frantically. "Help!" Helen Fletcher's voice, high and desperate. "Please, someone help! He's trapped!" They ran faster. The Fletcher farmhouse looked like a giant had stepped on it. The entire western wall had collapsed inward, beams jutting at grotesque angles, and through the wreckage Clara could see Helen Fletcher on her knees, clawing at debris with her bare hands. Blood streaked her arms, her dress was torn, and her face was a mask of terror. "James!" she screamed. "James, hold on!" Ethan vaulted over a fallen fence post and reached her first. "Where is he?" "There!" Helen pointed with a shaking hand toward a section where the wall had fallen across what looked like a heavy wooden beam. "The beam came down on his legs. I can't move it. I can't!" Her voice broke into sobs. Clara arrived seconds later, already assessing the situation with the calm focus her father had taught her during farm emergencies. Panic killed people. Clear thinking saved them. "Helen, look at me." Clara gripped the woman's shoulders, forcing eye contact. "Is he conscious?" "Yes, but he's screaming, and there's so much blood." "That means he's alive and his lungs work. Now listen carefully. We need light, clean cloth for bandages, whiskey if you have it, and wooden planks for splints. Can you get those things?" Helen stared at her, shock making her slow to process. Clara shook her gently. "Helen, can you get those things?" Something in Clara's voice, the absolute certainty, the command, cut through Helen's panic. She nodded jerkily. Yes, I can." "Then go. Now. We'll get him out." Helen scrambled toward what remained of her house while Clara turned to Ethan. He was already examining the beam trapping James Fletcher, his face grim in the moonlight. "It's oak," he said quietly. "Has to weigh 300 pounds, maybe more, and it's pinning both his legs." Clara could hear James Fletcher now, harsh, ragged breathing punctuated by moans of pain. She moved closer, picking her way carefully through the debris until she could see him. He was a large man, probably in his 50s, with a weathered face now gray with shock and pain. His legs disappeared under the massive beam, and even in the